director. And I'm Pierre Baron, I'm the multimedia
Baron.
And do you know a little bit about Human Rights Watch? We organized in different divisions. Look, I went down to the bottom. I mean, you know, this screen is not much bigger than this one, just a little bit. But we organized in regions: Africa, Americas, Asia, Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, United States. Branded for Life, you see here, this is a report on how in Florida some children, you know, I mean under 18, are tried as adults, meaning that, you know, children are supposed to go through a system that's really less about punishment but more about rehabilitation and a bit more caring. But the prosecutor will argue, normally can argue if the crime is really bad, that automatically is going to be tried as an adult. But in Florida there's a problem where they threaten kids if they don't plead guilty and then, you know, fast track the trial to be tried as adults. So they use that as a threat. So that's bad.
When I first got to adult court, my first plea offer was 15 years. Being 16, that's scary. I wasn't even thinking that far at that time. I was living day to day.
Last year, over 1,500 children were prosecuted as adults in the state of Florida, and they were prosecuted for crimes ranging from less serious property offenses to more serious offenses. If you're 16 or 17 in Florida, you can get sent to adult court for stealing a car. You can get sent to adult court for something called felony vandalism. You can get sent there for theft.
When I found out that I was going to be prosecuted as an adult, I didn't understand the terms and the meanings of what was happening. I didn't really think it was going to be that big of a deal. When I heard 15 to 25, 30 years, it just hit me.
Almost 98% of the children in Florida that are prosecuted as adults are sent to adult court via something called direct file. Now that's a statute that gives prosecutors incredibly broad discretion to decide which children should be sent to adult court. There's no judge that gets to review this decision. There's no process by which the child's attorney or the child can be heard. It's entirely the decision of the prosecutor.
We're seeing far too many children that should be dealt with in the juvenile system that has all the resources available to put them on the right track, entering into the adult system. In the juvenile system, the family plays a very important role. The parents are encouraged to be a part of the process, to guide the court with respect to issues that they're observing with the child at home.
In juvenile court, the judge, the prosecution, the defense counsel, everybody is really trying pretty much to craft an appropriate sentence for a particular child, looking at the kid's background, looking at what's happened. But the adult system is completely different. It's more of a processing system. It's punitive. It does not involve rehabilitation as a practical matter.
Going into adult court was a major change than the juvenile court. I mean, juvenile court, you know, you're sitting there and you can sit there next to your mom. But when I got to the adult court, I mean, the way you come in and the way they seat you and they show you like I said, no sympathy at all. I mean, you're a grown man now.
The juvenile system takes a lot of steps to try to protect the privacy of people who are prosecuted within it. Your record gets automatically sealed in your 20s if you go through juvenile court. The adult court system doesn't do that. That child becomes a convicted felon for the rest of his life for something that he did at age 15, 16. He doesn't get to vote, ever. He loses a lot of job opportunities because a lot of people don't want to hire convicted felons.
I didn't know how hard it was going to be to try and find a job or to try and have a life, to try to get an apartment, a car, or anything. I didn't know that you can't do all these things if you have a record.
We've all been children and we've all made mistakes, but when a child engages in negative behavior, criminal behavior, we have to give them opportunity to put that behind them and become something better in the future.
I need to start over. I need to show people, like, look, I'm capable of doing things. I'm not the same person I was, and I'm not going to keep making those dumb decisions.
Florida is sending entirely too many children into the adult system, and they're doing this via a process that gives all of the power to a single individual, the prosecutor, the person who is seeking a conviction. Florida needs to put the power back in the hands of a judge who will have a hearing where that child will have an opportunity to state his or her case about why they should stay in the juvenile system.
I'm stuck with something I did when I was 16 years old, and I'm out here free, but my life is still thrown away.
So the report is then finalized, and everybody here, we have a series of vetting process. Lots of people verify the information. Lawyers check that everything, is legally sound, etc. And then at the time of the release, we then have a news conference, a press conference often, maybe not always, where the journalists who we know are covering this issue, are invited. And we also send a press release via email to, again, we have a big database of journalists who we know either because they're covering, the judicial system in the States or in Florida, or they're local journalists. So we kind of curate and select the journalists who will be interested in that to send them the press release. And then we also do this video. So with the press release, they receive a link and they can view the video, and they can download also the material. The local station in Miami or something, if they want to do something, they can download the material, and maybe they do an extra interview, do their own, insert their reporter in it, but at least they have the interviews with these kids, for instance, which is hard to find, because you need to find, for a journalist like that doing this story very quickly, to find these cases of kids who have been tried as adults, it's quite complicated starting, it's like a little investigation. So us giving them that ready makes it really easy for them to cover the story, which is what we want them to do. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the strategy for the reports, and so we do research, we launch the report, it's in the press, which hopefully will force the decision makers who have access to changing the laws or telling the prosecutors they have to behave differently to change the situation, which is what we want at the end.
I mean, I don't know if you had a specific interest in LGBT issues. I know that you kind of approached the LGBT division.
Yeah, because it's a big issue now all over the world. We thought maybe it would be interesting.
Right, and sometimes precisely because it's a big issue all around the world, and it's treated differently in different parts of the world, is that sometimes a lot of press attention can be negative. It can in fact lead to a kind of a backlash. So we need to be sensitive to when we use a particular strategy and when we use a different strategy. So let me use one example just to illustrate that. We did a report on Liberia. So Liberia introduced two new laws, or two new laws were introduced into Parliament in Liberia. We didn't want to see those laws passing, but the laws were partly prompted by Hillary Clinton's speech made at the UN talking about gay rights. And she spoke about it very sensitively, saying that gay rights are human rights, recognizing that the US has a long way to go, recognizing that there are cultural sensitivities. It was a very well-written speech, but it was presented in Liberian media as gay rights or we'll cut aid. So then these two laws were proposed that made the situation even worse. So we wrote a report about the experience of LGBT people in Liberia, and then instead of having a press conference, we had a meeting, which we called a stakeholders meeting, that brought together government officials, the local LGBT group, who would never otherwise be able to meet with government, but because Human Rights Watch called the meeting, then the US ambassador said they would come, other ambassadors came, then the government officials were motivated to come, and the LGBT group. So that's a more quieter approach that sometimes we take. Or also in Nigeria, we've had some behind-the-scenes kind of work. But often, the LGBT work is very effective with media, and maybe you want to talk about the viral video on Russia.
I can show it to you.
Oh, I don't like to watch.
So we did this video. Usually our videos that have like minimum like 5,000 views to like maybe 100, 200,000. That's kind of like what's happening usually, which is not bad, right? But sometime earlier this year we had this video that in 24 hours we had like 1 million views.
Wow. That's a big difference.
And you'll see immediately why.
Хули ты так одет, ебать?
В смысле,
А?
с тематической вечеринки.
На нахуй.
Human Rights Watch has documented a large number of vicious attacks and aggressive harassment of LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people in Russia.
Еще раз так оденешься, хуеплет, блядь.
It's happening in the context of the homophobic legislation that bans propaganda of non-traditional sexual relationships among minors. A vigilante group, Occupy Pedophilia, essentially uses the pretext of protecting children, of fighting pedophilia, to harass and attack gay people.
Нет, ты пойдешь с нами. Да я не пойду, вот здесь я буду стоять нормально. Вот здесь я буду стоять.
They invite them for a fake date, and they proceed to berate them for their homosexuality, and in many cases, to abuse them physically. They film all these proceedings and then post them on social networks, on YouTube, to humiliate the victim even further.
Люди считают, что человек ЛГБТ это не человек, и это игрушка, с которой можно вот поиграться просто. Вот идет человек по улице, а почему бы не ударить там его?
What we see in these videos are criminal offenses happening in the context of complete impunity.
Оно носит организованный характер, то есть эта группа действует по всей стране, они координируются через интернет, и у этого движения есть четкая идеология, это неонацистская идеология. То есть надо четко понимать, с кем мы имеем дело. Мы имеем дело с фашистами, которые избрали себе самую легкую жертву, это геи. Вот. И они этого уже не скрывают даже.
In one of the most egregious cases of violence that we have seen so far and documented, an Uzbek migrant was lured and abducted by a group who burned his clothes. They put a gun, or what looked like a gun, to his head, and they threatened him with violence and forced him to say that he is gay, that he regrets that he is gay. And then they handcuffed him, gave him a glass bottle, and what they asked him to do is to rape himself with that bottle. Almost every single demonstration for the support of LGBT rights and LGBT equality that happened last year was met with aggression, violence, attacks, and harassment of LGBT activists. Police, on one hand, detained the LGBT activist, but on the other hand, there is a total failure on the part of the Russian law enforcement authorities to take active measures to prosecute hate crimes against LGBT people.
Сильный удар в лоб, после этого все спустилось под глаза, очень большие сильные отеки, один глаз вообще просто не открывался. Причем в полиции, когда я обратился, чтобы написать заявление, мне начали говорить сотрудники дежурной части о том, что это же все нормально, ты гей, как бы это нормально, то, что на тебя напали, зачем там вообще писать заявление, чтобы кого-то искать. Это нормально.
Russia should take active steps to investigate these homophobic crimes and bring the attackers to justice. It should also denounce publicly this violence and make sure that there is zero tolerance to homophobic crimes and violence in Russia. And the Russian authorities should repeal the federal propaganda law because it only inflates this type of violence. It only shows Russian people that LGBT community is second-class citizens in Russia and that violence against them is normal.
So the thing to understand is a human rights abuse is
what happens to
the difference between a human rights abuse and a crime. A human rights abuse is when the state mostly is not protecting you. So if I, hit you, that's a crime. The police should arrest me. The police is not arresting me, so that's a human rights abuse of his human rights, right? So here in this
the
video,
failure to protect violence from taking place in the first place.
So the police should protect everybody. So we have the right to, I don't know, the human rights. I mean, you have the right to life, you have the right to housing, we have the right to health. Those are the human rights we have. Now, when we don't have them, it's because
housing.
Not housing. No, it's because somebody is not. I'm a journalist. I'm not a human rights lawyer, but. I'll just finish and explain what we showed in the video. What we wanted to show in the video is that the police didn't do their job, basically. All these crimes are happening, and they're not arresting these people, they're letting these websites to proliferate, etc. And as you see at the LGBT demonstrations, they arrest the gay people and they let the other guys go free. So that was the kind of like... but I think also the video is popular because people kind of want to see these guys being beaten, or how are they going to beat the next one, and there's a bit of curiosity around it. And you can see, YouTube, we leave the comments open, and you can see there's really some homophobic comments in there. Now, our policy is free speech, so we leave all that open. If we had the resources to, the choice would be just to shut them off completely and leave no comment, but we believe in free speech, so we're leaving the comments open. Now, if we had enough staff to have a moderator who could really kind of remove what's really too much, we would do it, but we don't, so we leave it open. And from the comments, you can see there's more than a third homophobic, and who might be it's not representative. Maybe these people will be more interested to look for videos like that anyway, so it doesn't really mean. And 2/3 are saying what's happening in Russia is disgusting, so they should.
Is it frustrating to just be able to make videos and then just hope someone will notice it?
Well, the videos is part of it. What the basic thing is to do in-depth research. That is, the researchers would do. The interviews, as Pierre was explaining, is that it's always done by a human rights watch researcher who would document the abuses, and then that is written into a report. And so the idea behind the report is that it's very carefully checked, and so that the reputation of the organization rests on the reliability of the report, right? So a lot of emphasis is put on the accuracy and the detail that's contained in that report, and then every report has very specific recommendations that the government or whatever entity is asked to do this, and this to rectify the problem. So it's always very specific, very detailed, and focused on accuracy. So the report is like the substance, but it's not it's not something that people will pick up and read. So the multimedia is also a way of promoting, making it much more visible and having a much bigger audience than we would have just with the report. But the report is what is used in order to meet with government officials and say, this is the problem, and when the government officials say it isn't, you say, well, here is all the evidence that shows how much of a problem it actually is, and this is what you can do to address it.
Okay.
And then there are different mechanisms that we can use to ensure that it's addressed. Because as Pia was saying, is that it's based on the fairly narrow but well-defined terms of international human rights law. So that's the area in which we work. So that there's a legal basis for the kinds of reports that we do in terms of what's agreed through the UN system, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the various other treaties that go to back that up and support that, that all countries have, who are members of the UN, have signed on to and agreed to, so that they have a legal contract in order to abide by certain human rights principles. And what the reports do is show when they fall short of those principles that they've already signed on to and agreed to. So there's a legal basis for what we do, but we stick within those narrow parameters of what is legal in terms of international human rights law.
But does the Russian government respond on the report? And
Oh, I see what you're also saying is that no. I mean, sometimes Russia doesn't care.
No.
But what is the point then of doing the work? In this instance, the report, one of the points is that the Russian LGBT groups are really pushing for some prosecutions at least to take place of the people who are perpetrating the violence. And so the report helps to give the evidence to those groups in their work in order to at least get some of these people prosecuted for doing what they're doing. Okay, that may or may not happen. But also we can use it at the UN, because at the UN, Russia is presenting itself as the guardian of traditional values. And so we're using this to say this is what traditional values means, the way in which Russia is using it. So don't be fooled by what Russia is saying by taking the moral high ground around traditional values. This is what traditional values translates to in Russia. So it has that effect to discredit Russia in its drive to push back on LGBT rights at the UN, which it's doing very consistently and very systematically under this idea of protecting traditional values. And it gets a lot of support internationally for that. So that's another value of this kind of report.
In Washington, D.C., we found that a number of victims who report sexual assault are treated insensitively, are not believed, are blamed for their assaults, and are traumatized by their experience with police.
I got the weapon away from him. I saved myself. I started to feel like a victim because of my interactions with the police. They didn't believe me. They made me feel ashamed for questioning them.
When we started to speak with victims, witnesses, community service groups, and others who work in the hospital and work closely with victims, we discovered that people were concerned that their cases weren't being investigated.
They made me feel like I was making something up, when all I was trying to do was tell them what happened so that it could be reported accurately, so that it wouldn't happen again.
If one case gets shut down because it was improperly handled, then you have an offender who is going to continue to offend against probably several other women.
They never really gave me straight answers. At points they stopped returning my phone calls. This guy was never caught. I sort of knew the second he ran away, if they didn't catch him that night when he was in a shirt covered in my blood, they were never going to catch him.
All cases of sexual assault need to be investigated. They don't all have to be prosecuted, but police are required to investigate.
I was told by this policeman that they have a lot of sexual assaults, and he knew right away that there wasn't enough evidence. I asked him, do you believe me? Do you believe this? Because the light bulb started to go off that maybe he wasn't on my side. Maybe he just didn't believe me and he didn't have time for this. And he said to me, I believe you believe this. And my response was, okay, we're done. And I never talked to him since then.
I can't say I blame her, because what that statement basically says is you might be mentally ill. I mean, you have bought into something that isn't real.
Yeah, I don't know, but I think maybe, it's just the worst part of the experience in some ways, you know? It's really true when they say it can just be re-traumatizing. I definitely felt just traumatized all over again.
A negative initial response from a police officer is going to further traumatize the victim. The few women who do come forward, if they're treated negatively by the system, it's going to create a much larger chilling effect that's going to continue to depress the number of reports.
When the detective was asking me questions, I felt like it wasn't to elicit information that she could use, but it was also to find out how I was at fault. And I just walked away from that thinking she doesn't see me as a real victim. She sees me as a whiner, as somebody who's just complaining, not as somebody who has rights that need to be protected. I think the way that I was treated was so traumatizing. And in fact, when I sought some mental health services after the crime occurred, I focused more on my treatment by the police than I did on what actually happened with the assault. And I've heard that that's not uncommon. I think that I would have healed from this a lot faster if I hadn't reported to the police.
Sexual assault is already the most underreported violent crime. So we would hope that all cases are investigated thoroughly and that victims are treated with respect and dignity when they come to the police to report a sexual assault.
Of how, and it's happening here in America, you know, in the States where you think people have access to lots of services, etc. And frankly, it's really, these women only had Human Rights Watch to help them fight against the police. So you understood the story, right? The police wouldn't take them seriously when reporting rape crimes. And so the whole report was really looking at statistics in Washington, D.C. that show that it's different from other states. There's something wrong going on there, where you have a certain number of women going to the hospital, you know, for treatment after being raped, let's say, and then, but only very few cases are investigated. Unlike in other states where, you know, you have so many at the hospital and so many cases. So there's something wrong going on in DC. So if the report was all about the numbers and this and that, and then we had the video as well. And the police chief in Washington, D.C., this woman is very strong and was really defending all along, you know, the research. We were talking to the police and saying, well, this is wrong. And they were like, no, 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 no. But then she couldn't say no to this. You know, it was really hard to say, well, she's a liar. You know, it's hard because everybody sees them, it's emotional. So the video really helped, you know, to make our case. And right now they changed the laws, and they're using this video now in Austin, Texas, to train the police, to explain the, you know, and so that's a success, a good story. I mean, I'm not going to say it's rare, but it's very difficult.
But how important is the president, because he with the gay subject, well, we know how he thinks about it, but he has to deal with all those states. So what's his influence then?
Well, I mean, you know, because of this political system in the U.S., there's a lot of autonomy in terms of the different states. So, I mean, the U.S. president is definitely, the current U.S. president has been very influential in terms of speaking out in terms of marriage equality and kind of don't ask, don't tell in terms of the military. So, I mean, he has, you know, his position by making that position public, it definitely influences kind of opinion, but it's not as if what the president says would apply to all states, because there's a high level of independence in terms of what states can decide for themselves. So it's the way in which the US political system works, which is very different from other political systems, such as South African. So in South Africa, where same-sex marriage passes, it passes for the whole country, right? And it passes through them.
And where do you get your resources, like money?
Yes,
Stuff-wise?
that's complicated. We don't get any government money from any government anywhere. So we only get private funding and foundation funding. And even the private funding we get, we don't get from we won't take money from people who like have a sweatshop in Bangladesh. So people who are going to give money, a substantial amount of money, also their background is looked into, because we don't want to compromise our reputation in any way. So that's a very strict rule. It means we've got a limited pool of funding. Actually, interestingly, we get a lot of money, of course, from the States. We get a lot of money from the Netherlands.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, individual giving in the Netherlands, and particularly for the LGBT program, it's one of our biggest sources of funding comes from the Netherlands. So the Dutch public are traditionally very generous and sympathetic to the human rights cause. And we partnered, in fact, with HIVOS, on a project in sub-Saharan Africa for 2 years. They were doing one aspect of it, we were doing the other, and the Dutch postcode lottery gave us a lot of money to do that project over a period of 2 years.
That's really true.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's really true that they give you money. It's not just
You're so
a
good.
marketing stunt. Marketing stunt of something.
Right. No, they really did give us money. Although they do like their they do like the marketing aspect as well, right? To show what work they do back at home.
Do you have an example of a case that has been picked up by the government?
Where they've changed? Yeah.
In the Netherlands, actually.
Oh.
With the transgender law.
Really?
Yes.
When was it?
Well, the transgender law was changed in December last year, but there was a very outdated law, and it required irreversible sterilization and surgical procedures in order to change your gender identity in your papers. So it was linking medical procedures to administration. And then, the law was under review, and we knew it was under review, but we did a research report at that time that interviewed a lot of transgender people to find out what it was they wanted to see in the law. And then we presented that to the Dutch Parliament, and basically the law incorporates all except one of the recommendations that were in the report. So, there it's a good situation because the Dutch government is very responsive to it, and they were initiating a change, so we were helpful for that by doing the research that would inform them about what kind of changes needed to be made and what the transgender community wanted to see. So that's one example.
One question.
My
question. I just asked you, the one on camera, that New York City and Amsterdam are rights almost the same. Or about
not only New York, but the human rights of the States, and then, for example, LGBT, compared to the Netherlands, how the difference between the two countries.
Okay, I think the main difference is that there's, as we've discussed, is that it depends on what state you're talking about. So a state like in New York, it's pretty liberal in terms of the equality for LGBT people, including marriage equality, which has been introduced here, but quite recently. Whereas the Netherlands introduced same-sex marriage, was the first country in the world, in fact, to include same-sex marriage. And in fact, my colleague, who is the advocacy director of the LGBT rights program and is currently based in Berlin, is Boris Dietrich, who was the person who introduced the marriage equality bill into the Dutch Parliament, right? So there's a long history there of an association with LGBT equality in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands has in many ways been very progressive and led the way internationally, actually, on LGBT equality, and has also done very good work around the world in terms of advancing LGBT equality. When we think of the work of HIVOS, it was one of the first international donor agencies that would work on LGBT issues, and has been doing so for some time. So, from that point of view, I think the Netherlands has really played a very positive role, not only domestically in terms of the law there, but also internationally in improving the situation for LGBT people who are living in much more difficult circumstances.
Do